I'm very happy to introduce our first keynote speaker, Professor Leon Tikly from Bristol University. As I said, he will speak to us online. He's currently on a professorship in South Africa. Leon is a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and UNESCO chair on inclusive education, on inclusive and good quality education for all at the University of Bristol. Good morning, Leon. Good to see you.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here.
He has recently directed a network on transforming education for sustainable futures. His scholarship over many years has focused on globalization and education policy in the post-colonial world and on initiatives to improve the quality of education for disadvantaged learners, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Between 2005 and 2011, he directed a research program consortium on improving education quality in low-income countries. And he has also conducted a number of research projects and written extensively on issues of race, ethnicity, and education in the United Kingdom and globally. And more recently, he has written at the intersection between decolonial scholarship and education for sustainable futures. His work is informed theoretically by critical realism, post-colonial and decolonial perspectives, and is underpinned by a commitment to social, environmental, and epistemic justice. Sorry for this. So Leon will elaborate on education inequalities from the perspective of the global class. Thank you, Leon. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Margarita. And I'd like to start off by thanking the organizers, the Austrian Foundation for Development, the university department, and the Paulo Freire Zentrum for your kind invitation to talk at your important and interesting event today. As you probably gathered from Margarita's introduction, my disciplinary orientation is probably more towards the sociological and the critical, and I'll be really presenting what I think will be hopefully thought-provoking analysis of the so-called learning crisis in education. And I want to argue that in fact it's probably better to reframe the idea of the learning crisis as a crisis of violence. And I want to explain what I mean by that. I want to argue that actually, when we begin to conceive of the current crisis as a crisis of violence, we begin to get a bit closer to the underlying causes of inequality in education around the world. Next slide, please. So I want to start off by providing a critical overview of the discourse of the learning crisis. And then I want to argue, make my case for why we need to conceive it more realistically as a crisis of violence. And then I want to talk about how education, in the spirit of what Margarita was saying earlier, might also be a vehicle for more peaceful, just and sustainable futures. And I want to suggest what that looks like in terms of how we might reimagine education systems. And I want to argue principally that we need to think of both decolonizing and decarbonizing our education systems and what that might mean. Next slide, please. Okay, so the learning crisis, as we know, is a very dominant discourse for explaining inequalities in education at the moment. It's popularized by the World Bank as well as other organizations, and it's often used to refer to the fact that although there has been some progress in improving access to primary education, learning outcomes, as measured in standardized tests of literacy and numeracy, remain very low in many parts of the low-income world. Worst affected, according to this discourse, are often learners from low socioeconomic backgrounds, girls, minorities, and rural dwellers. In order to address the crisis, the World Bank proposes a range of what are really, I suggest, technocratic solutions principally focusing on improving the effectiveness of teachers and teaching, the use of technology to support learning, and improving accountability within education systems. Next slide, please. So this is from the Global Education Monitoring Report, and it really shows often how the learning crisis is represented in statistical terms. So here the slide focuses on gender parity index, and it shows differences in access, but also in learning in literacy and numeracy for girls as compared to boys. I'm sure we're all familiar with this kind of data, and it's important data. It's important because it represents, at least at a surface level, the disparities, some of the disparities that we want to try to redress. Next slide, please. So here you can see again, how these disparities are represented, this time in terms of completion rates, and how learning disparities are also considered in relation to wealth disparities within the wider population. So as I suggested just now, these data are important. They provide what critical realists such as Roy Bhaskar and others describe and as a surface actuality. They tell us at a surface level that there is a problem, and this is important. What these data don't tell us, and what the discourses of the learning crisis often fail to illuminate, are the underlying causal mechanisms, what it is that gives rise to this surface actuality. Next slide, please. So I want to argue that in order to better understand the nature of the crisis in education, it's better to conceive the crisis actually as a crisis of violence. And in a moment, I'm going to explain a little bit what I mean by that. But first of all, just to say that, as has been noted, there are several problems with how the idea of the learning crisis is currently framed. For a start, focusing on such a narrow range of cognitive outcomes in terms of usually literacy and numeracy outcomes in standardized tests is linked to, in my view, an instrumentalist view of education as contributing principally to human capital development. So we know that the big turning point for the World Bank followed research undertaken in the 90s and early noughties, which sought to show that, that improvements in basic literacy and numeracy contribute to economic growth. And it is this kind of discourse that has predominated, that has driven the international financial institutions and many donor organizations to take account of learning outcomes. Whereas previously, under the MDG regime, of course, the focus was much more on access, issues of access, particularly to primary education. So what this kind of instrumentalist discourse does is it narrows the view of the purpose of education to an instrumentalist one linked to economic growth, and it fails to take account or to consider the idea that education might promote the development of a wider set of capabilities that can contribute to the realization of social, environmental, and epistemic justice within peaceful and democratic and sustainable societies, and also to peace and transitional justice, which in such a conflict-ridden world is increasingly important, as we know. So, of course, these kinds of ideas about the purpose of education resonate more strongly with SDG 4. The focus is also often on a rather narrow set of inequalities. There are some inequalities that are completely elided in the discourse. Issues of race and racism, for example, as we've argued elsewhere, are often almost completely elided. There are no data collected on this, and the language of race and racism is not reflected in any of the discourses about SDG 4. There are also other markers of inequality, including language, the home language of learners, which is a powerful predictor of inequality, but again is not often explicitly addressed in these kinds of discourses. Some other key markers on predictors of inequality, such as class in the Western world, caste in India, and some other southern contexts, are treated often simplistically in terms of disparities in wealth, rather than, from a more sociological point of view, as structural and relational features of modern capitalist societies. This is significant because it limits the way that we understand the nature of the crisis and what is required in order to address the crisis. Finally, by focusing on technocratic solutions, these dominant discourses often elide the profound effect of different forms of violence: direct violence, structural and cultural violence, that has the effect of limiting the capability of learners. And this takes me to my key argument that the narrow focus of contemporary discourses masks a much deeper and more profound crisis that blights our education systems, namely a crisis of violence. Next slide, please. So what do we mean by violence? Well, people do talk about violence in our field, within the field of international education development, but often in the discourses of UNESCO and UNICEF, for example, it's defined principally in terms of school violence, instances of physical violence, psychological and sexual violence, and also violence that arises through conflict and the effect of conflict on education. Following the sociologist Galtung's understanding of violence, very famous, of course, very highly influential back in the 60s and 70s, as well as other recent scholars of violence, we want to adopt a more expansive understanding. So by we, I mean my colleague Julia Paulson and myself, who have developed this understanding of violence that I will present to you, that attends to the multiple forms of harm inflicted by violence. Our definition also seeks to take account of power, which is again absent from much of the discussion about the learning crisis, but we think is critical to understanding violence, the different kinds of violence. But also it's important, the use of power, in making violence invisible in these discourses. And I'll explain what I mean by that. At a definitional level, we define violence as any act of power, whether directly or via systemic and cultural forms, that results in physical, psychological, emotional, environmental, or spiritual harm, and that has the effect of limiting the capabilities. And here we refer to Senna Nussbaum's idea of human capability, available to individuals, groups, but also to other species and natural systems. Next slide, please. Okay, so I won't, this is our representation of what we describe as the ontology of violence, what violence is, the reality of violence, if you like, that it exists in terms of three overlapping dimensions that have been mentioned: the direct violence, systemic violence, and cultural violence. And of course, as Galtung did with his original framework, we see these forms of violence as reproducing each other, as being implicated in each other. We see that these forms of violence operate in relation through different forms of power. So in the case of direct violence, the term cycles of violence leads us to think about the exercise of coercive power, which we see so graphically around the world as we speak. But also systemic violence. And here, you know, the reference is rather to material power, to the regimes of inequality, the intersecting regimes of inequality, of class, gender, race, ethnicity, and so on, that are linked to the nature, that are built in, that are wired into the structure of neoliberal capitalism and globalization. And in terms of cultural violence, the role of what Antonio Gramsci describes as cultural hegemony, the intellectual and moral leadership of the West, and the way that that becomes reflected in the dominance of the disciplines as they've been developed in the West, and what Boaventura de Sousa Santos describes as the epistemicide, the destruction, the marginalization, the undermining of non-Western and indigenous knowledge systems and languages. These three forms of violence are evident in education systems, and they limit between them the abilities for human flourishing, for the development of human capabilities. But they also have an effect on other species and natural systems. The extent to which our education systems prepare people for participation in within petro-capitalist economies, but also don't prepare learners with the tools, the equipment, the ideas, the skills to lead more sustainable livelihoods, means that our education systems also contribute to environmental violence, which is a dimension of violence that Galtung began to talk about but didn't elaborate. Next slide, please. So I suggested before that, in fact, you know, that one of the aspects of cultural violence, of hegemony, of the way that our understanding of the learning crisis is framed, is that these different forms of violence often become invisible. We only see the real tips of the iceberg when it comes to these different kinds of violence. We see, for example, in the tables presented earlier, differences in learning outcomes, which actually are consequences of systemic violence, as well as these other forms. We see, you know, the instances reported of direct violence and of cultural violence. We hear about sometimes, but often these are made invisible within education systems. Next slide, please. So in terms of direct violence, we know how pressing this issue is. We know that that more than 22,000 students, teachers, and academics have been injured, killed, or harmed in attacks on education during armed conflict just between 2015 and 19. There are more than 11,000 separate attacks on education facilities, students, and educators. And of course, on a daily basis, we see this unfolding in Gaza, how schools themselves have become targets for military action. The number of countries experiencing attacks on education has also increased in recent years, with 93 countries experiencing at least one reported attack on education. Women and girls are often specifically targeted. Besides the physical and psychological damage inflicted on children and young people, there are also devastating effects on school enrollments. Currently, 28 million children are out of school in conflict-affected countries. But also, you know, it has a gender dimension. Pregnancy from rape, the health consequences and stigma of sexual violence, the risk of early marriage, and so on, are particularly difficult for girls, make it particularly difficult for girls to return to school after conflict. Next slide, please. But there are also more tacit, unreported, or forms of violence that go behind the radar, under the radar. Corporal punishment is a widely occurring form of violence, even though UNESCO and other organizations have campaigned for many years against it. But it's never mentioned in discourses about the learning crisis. Corporal punishment, the beating of children, the physical harm inflicted by teachers on children, remains legal in 69 countries. Although it's prohibited in 128 countries, its use often goes underreported. Bullying as well is a major source of school-based violence. Almost 1 in 3 students around the world have been bullied by their peers. But other types of direct violence are more invisibilized. They are made invisible. The data on sexualized violence, for example, is limited, although we know it's prevalent. The same is true of other kinds of violence, of homophobic bullying, which we're not, in many countries, we're not even allowed to talk about. Data relating to some forms of violence, including the violence inflicted on people with disabilities, racialized violence, including anti-Black violence, Islamophobia, anti-Semitic bullying, are even more limited and often confined to a handful of countries where these data exists. We now need, of course, to take account of cyberbullying. Next slide, please. But of course, what Galtung was at pains to point out was how these forms of direct violence don't happen in isolation. They are linked to structural violence. Clive Harbour, in his work back in 2004 on schooling as violence, reminds us that the history of the development of modern mass education systems is directly violent. In its evolution in industrializing Western Europe and its extension via the colonial project, the aim was to discipline bodies as well as to regulate minds, to make people, in other words, economically useful and politically docile. And this basic view of education as a bullying institution remains relevant today in many post-colonial contexts where instead of the colonial masters, education rather serves the interests of indigenous elites who often don't send their children to public schools, but to privileged private ones. Scholarship over many years has emphasized how schools both reflect and reproduce inequalities based on social class. They operate primarily as a filtering mechanism in many societies, where there's particularly those where there's more limited access to secondary and tertiary education, but also to labor markets. And it's not just class, but also caste-based inequalities have been exacerbated by the increasing privatization of education. So if you look at data in India since the rollout of low-fee private schools, for example, one can see this growth in inequality, but also in other class-based societies as well. Inequalities in class and caste has, of course, as we know, as Margarita alluded to, been exacerbated by the digital divide, and particularly evident during the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. We also know when we're talking about structural violence that feminist scholarship has shown how schools and other educational institutions are both shaped by and reproduce patriarchal norms and values and gender disparities and patriarchy in wider society. Specifically with reference to gender-based violence, we know that these are linked directly with wider gender-based inequalities in society. Scholarship has also shown how schools reproduce racial disparities. Just a small example, or very important one, Angela Davis in her abolitionist work connects schools and prisons. She argues that schools in poor communities of color in the United States are repressive, militarized institutions that replicate the structures and regimes of the prison, replacing a greater emphasis on discipline and security than on personal growth and development. These schools, she argues, serve as prep schools for prison, and are institutions of racism and repression. Salim Vali, my colleague's work in South Africa, has shown that corporal punishment as a mechanism of discipline in schools. Again, we need to understand how this relates to wider authoritarian, the wider, more authoritarian nature of societies. In his case, he related its continuing prevalence to the legacy of apartheid in South Africa. Next slide, please. But we also need to take account of cultural violence, which in Galtung's terms provides legitimation for the other kinds of violence. Cultural violence is inherent within the framing of the so-called learning crisis. Children, 85% of children in sub-Saharan Africa, are framed as lacking age-appropriate skills and the ability to read or understand a basic story. They are learning the least. This deficit framing ignores the knowledge, skills, resilience, and agency that children and their communities actually have, including for navigating the violence of their daily lives, and frames them against their failed future productivity. Hundreds of millions of children, according to the World Bank, are framed as reaching adulthood without even the most basic of skills. This is typical kind of language that's used in the learning crisis discourse, and unable to build fulfilling careers. In failing to contribute to the human capital of their nations, these learners are made disposable, in Henry Giroux's terms, via the learning crisis discourse. Next slide, please. But also we know that curricula and pedagogy are still highly influenced by colonial education structures. They often fail to represent or they actively undermine indigenous or local knowledge. They prioritize Eurocentric understandings, what constitutes valuable knowledge and skills. They contribute, in other words, to what Boaventura de Sousa Santos has described as epistemicide. The coloniality of modern education systems is also evident in the rigid structuring of the school day, according to Western linear conceptions of time. Let's not forget how modern schooling was introduced violently through colonialism, but also that teacher-centered, top-down and authoritarian approaches to pedagogy have the same roots in the colonial education. Curricula contribute to maintain historical narratives of dominant groups. They silence, erase, and devalue the experiences, the memories, the meaningful figures and events of minoritized groups. They contribute both to the maintenance of structural ignorance, as Charles Mills describes it, and to the exclusion of learners' lived realities. Discussions of the learning crisis pay limited attention to the epistemic injustice in what and how many learners study. For example, European languages imposed during colonialism, which may not be the same languages that learners speak at home, are primarily or indeed only language of instruction in many contexts. And people, have written about this extensively, but it's never really considered in the learning crisis discourse. Elizabeth Erling, for example, has written about it. And in fact, Elizabeth has a book coming out, a little plug for your book, Elizabeth, and a book launch, I think, later today for the book, which looks precisely at this issue, how the disparities in language, the language of instruction policies actually contribute majorly to disparities in outcomes. But also educational technology, including that during the pandemic. Of course, it has many benefits, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But big data and the use of AI have also been used in this context to reproduce racial and gender profiling because of the algorithms that are often inherent in artificial intelligence. Next slide, please. So now I come to the part where I hope to talk a little bit more positively about what education can do. And I think going back to Margarita's earlier point, I've argued that education does play a key role in constraining the opportunity freedoms, the capabilities of learners. But it can also play a role, it's Janus faced in this respect, it can also play a role in supporting just transitions to more sustainable futures. And here I'm referring to Mark Swilling's understanding of the term of just transition. He describes it as a process of increasingly radical incremental changes that accumulate over time in the actually emergent, transformed world envisaged by the SDGs and sustainability. The outcome is a state of well-being founded on greater environmental sustainability and social justice. These changes arise not by accident or by the action of technocrats, but by the struggles of ordinary people, with our assistance, hopefully, each with their own context-specific temporal and spatial dimensions. And these struggles might be diverse. They might be the struggles of racialized or minoritized groups, of women, of people from low socioeconomic castes and class, of disabled people struggling against their own forms of oppression. Next slide, please. So recently, Kylian Mbembe, the Cameroonian critical theorist, gave a talk at a UNESCO conference last year, where he outlined this idea of a new planetary consciousness. And the argument is that really this can provide an alternative way of framing education fit for the 21st century. It differs from the universalizing assumptions of Western European thoughts, particularly as represented in some of the more scientific ways of thinking about the world, that there's only one road to the truth. There's only one way of conceiving truth, of reality, only one way of conceiving knowledge. Rather, this is built on the idea of the all-worldness of human beings, the idea that we need to draw on all of the archives of the world, the knowledge archives of the world, not just European archives, from indigenous and local knowledge systems that have traditionally provided more synergistic views, not only of the relationship between human beings with each other, but of human beings with nature, but also with the non-human, with tools, with technology. So this idea of a new planetary consciousness is emergent. It encourages us to think about these relationships, the ones we have with each other, with nature, with technology. And it's underpinned by an ethics of care for our planet, learning to care for it, learning to repair it, and above all, to share it. Okay, next slide, please. So what does this mean in terms of how we might reimagine the futures of education or education for more just and sustainable futures? So I think one place to start, of course, is with SDG 4 itself. That, when we talk about inclusion, we mean inclusion not just based on the very narrow understanding of the term implied by human capital type discourse, the learning crisis type discourse, but inclusion more broadly conceived in terms of the groups that have been identified as being the subjects of violence, whether those be racialized or minoritized groups, disabled people, speakers of minority languages, minoritized languages, and so on. But also that our idea of quality itself must be inclusive of the idea that we of valuing all of our knowledge systems, not just European, Western-based knowledge systems. That actually, when we think of a quality education, we are also thinking about indigenous and local knowledge, non-Western knowledge systems. But also that we need to think also about how we think about education systems themselves, that we conceive of education systems often in very formalized terms. You know, we've all seen these organograms that appear in, you know, education development plans that show a linear relationship, top-down relationship between the ministry and various subsectors of education and training. We need a much more fluid and holistic view of education systems, as including not just formal education institutions, but informal learning that happens within communities, forms of social learning. What we need to be doing, and we don't have much time for this, colleagues. You know, the demands of unsustainable development, of climate change, really mean that we need to urgently find ways to develop learning pathways, not just in formal institutions, but between formal institutions and processes of social learning in communities that are available throughout the lifespan, that can equip communities with the capabilities required to realize more just and sustainable futures, so that learners can learn in school, but they can also learn from their communities, and the knowledge in the communities is valued, the tacit knowledge, the forms of adaptation that communities have developed, for example, to climate change, become part of the learning that individuals pick up as they progress through their learning lives. We need to conceive, though, of learners not just as knowledge takers, but as knowledge makers. There's a very important role for universities, but also for schools and colleges and others to work with with our communities. We need to break down the ivory tower of our academic institutions. We need to understand how we can co-create knowledge between formal education institutions and communities to address the wicked problems of unsustainable development. For us in universities, this requires being epistemically humble, as my colleague Prachi Srivastava describes it, that we need to understand the value other knowledge systems outside of disciplinary expertise and genuinely foster transdisciplinary approaches that are based on co-creation and equitable partnership work. And it's engage our communities, not just as passive receivers of knowledge, but as active generators of relevant knowledge that's relevant and owned by them to tackle the problems that they hold dear. But this also means defending and expanding our idea of the knowledge commons. Of course, you know, it has been expanded through the digital commons, but we need to use our resources. You know, we need to use technology, digital means to also diversify knowledge systems, the knowledge that is available on UNESCO websites and other websites around the world, where we can archive, we can present the archives of the world in Mbembe's terms. But we need to urgently decolonize the curriculum. And what that means is that we need to decenter the Eurocentric bias of the existing curriculum. We need to challenge it, its assumptions, its universalizing assumptions. Colleagues, this doesn't mean doing away with the disciplines. This is really important to state. It doesn't mean doing it, but it does mean transforming the disciplines. It means bringing the disciplines into generative conversation with other knowledge systems. So indigenous knowledge systems like Ubuntu, for example, in South Africa, where I'm based at the moment, you know, present a much more synergistic view, interconnected view of human beings and of the natural world. We need to encourage processes of pedagogical border crossing, as it's sometimes described, so that learners can value not just the distinctiveness, but also the synergies that can be developed by moving between knowledge systems, so that they, as critical citizens of the future, can decide which kinds of knowledge are relevant. And again, colleagues, this is not an argument for relativism. I'm not a relativist, I'm a critical realist. I believe in an external reality outside of our perceptions of it, but I also believe strongly that we understand that reality from different vantage points, and that different knowledge systems help us to understand different aspects of that reality. But we also need to decarbonize the curriculum. We need to urgently focus on sustainability and planetary well-being, in line with Tikly and Mbembe's idea of a new planetary consciousness. Education should go beyond traditional academic disciplines and explicitly integrate sustainability-related knowledge and values. This includes not just environmental awareness, ecological stewardship, responsible consumption, and understanding the interconnectedness of social, economic, and environmental systems, but it also has a pedagogical dimension. Land-based, place-based learning can really complement what happens in schools and colleges and provide a way of breaking down those barriers that we talked about earlier. But most of all, we need to understand and tackle the violence that's endemic to our education system around the world, that has its roots in the colonial past, but also in the nature of neoliberal globalization. We need to understand how each of these forms of violence is distinct, but also how they are connected. And we need to think about how we can overcome these and work towards an education system for just and sustainable futures. Okay, I'll leave it there, colleagues. I realize I've been talking for quite a long time, but I hope at least the talk has helped to provoke some thoughts, whether you agree with me or not, about the nature of the crisis facing our education systems today that gives rise to the inequalities that we witness so viscerally, so in such a real way every day. Thank you.